And I'll begin by saying hello. Welcome again to another session of Composition 2 with me, Mr. Fowler, and several of your fellow classmates. I know a couple of you are waiting to be admitted here and connect to the audio. That's A-okay. I'm going to quickly share a screen with you guys and gals. And then like I said a minute ago, I'm going to open up, or a moment ago rather, I'm going to open up the class for discussion. So let me do that real quickly so we can see what's going on for today. I'm going to share this with you. Okay. And slideshow, I'll show that from the beginning. So for today's session, we're simply going to be focused on the argumentative essay and how to draft that. Just talking about some of the key moves to make and ideas to express as part and parcel of that draft process. And then the other half of our class time roughly will be given over to the argumentative writing lab. Okay, so that's what's on our agenda for today. Like I said, a little bit of a shorter discussion time for today's session, but let's begin with some open Q&A. Are there other additional concerns or any initial questions for today? Just use your hand raise emoticon so that I can address you one at a time if there are multiple questions. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
I guess what would be your advice on starting research? What would be the best place to kind of get the ground running?
That's a great question. And I'm going to have to admit to being a broken record here, but I would start using some of our library database sources, maybe opposing viewpoints for this paper, especially as a starting point, because that might enable you to get a wider sense of where an argument's key, how do I want to say this? Where the two key perspectives or where the multiple perspectives on this particular topic might lie. That way you could gather a lot of potential resource information about from both perspectives or from multiple perspectives so that you can most readily align your feelings to some of the information that is available according to the perspective you are already taking up on that topic. From there, if there's not enough coverage or you don't feel like the material is sufficient, I might try a more refined search on EBSCOhost. And there was another one, maybe some of the other students can help me out, but I can't quite remember. There was another really good resource referenced by our librarian during that that session that we had with Carol. And I want to say it was like Legal Viewpoints or something like that. And I remember it had a blue mallet. Does anybody remember? Either you can speak up or type it into the chat what the name of that was, that research database. I can also reach out to Carol too, and I'll send you the information and put a link up on Desire to Learn. But there was one about legal or court precedents as they related to some of these more debatable potential topics. So that would be good. Great question. Well, let's go ahead and get into it. And if a question comes up naturally, you can use the hand raise emoticon and I can pause what I'm talking about and we can go ahead. I'm going to stop my personal video, but I'll be screen sharing right away. Okay. So again, today, just a little bit about the drafting process as it relates specifically to the argumentative style of paper. So most of the information that I'm going to write about today is already appended in a PowerPoint that's attached to today's lecture points on Desire to Learn. But most of this material will be coming to you vis-a-vis Practical Arguments, which is our other text that was assigned for the course. And that's going to come out of Chapter 7. So when it comes to the writing process, it only makes a certain amount of sense that before you begin writing an argumentative essay, you need to understand the specific process for that endeavor. It's a little bit different than an analysis and a persuasive essay. And there are some specific moves that you have to make. However, the general ideas about how to respond to an audience's needs using those 4 pillars of communication will be relatively similar. So it's not going to be completely new material that we're getting into. The first thing to do is begin in the planning stages, and that means choosing a specific topic. So for this particular assignment, you have some pre-designed course topics for those of you who wanted to write about the Princess Bride. But if you're writing about an alternative topic, which a number of you are, and I'm happy to have something new and different to read about, you may want to start to think about what type of topic that you want to select and how to focus that topic. So one of the things that our authors, Mandel and Kersner, suggest is that when you're planning your topic, you select something with which you have an emotional stake. In other words, it's a topic that you care about to some extent. And you can see in this little graphic over here on the right-hand side that there, excuse me, that there may be a little bit of a difference between simply the topics that you love to talk about and topics that you know well, and a topic that your audience is invested in. When you can combine those 3 ideas or those 3 aspects of a potential argumentative paper topic, you typically end up in the middle, which is where you want to limit your choices. Make sure that you still have an open mind about this topic, meaning the authors of the text suggest that you have an open mind about new information you may come across. That doesn't mean they want you to change your perspective. Don't make that mistake. They just want you to be aware that oftentimes in the writing process, new or better information comes into the student's purview that might alter their own potential feelings about it in the process of writing. I've had that happen to students multiple times, especially high school students when I used to teach at the high school level. So keep an open mind about your topic and make sure that it's not so broad that it will overwhelm you in the research process. An example from our text of a type of open-ended paper that's maybe assigned in a college course is this one. Write a 5-page essay on a topic related to college services, facilities, or curricula. Now, I'm not, just to clarify, because I know a couple of you jumped in a little bit later, I'm not asking you to write about that, but that's an example that your authors, Kersner and Mandel, use for the book. So one of the first things you would need to do is narrow that topic down, focusing on one particular service or program or facility or curriculum. Let's suppose, for the sake of this example that we're working through today, that you focused on the green movement on college campuses, which is just a movement to, avoid wasting resources and to maximize uh, resources while having less of a negative impact on the environment directly. Okay, so that's our topic. So that might be a good topic. By contrast, you would probably want to avoid particular topics. Now, the first one's a bit of a misnomer, topics that are fact-based. What the authors mean when they say that you should avoid fact-based topics are those that don't really have much of an argumentative slant to them. For example, you could argue, realistically, you could argue that recycled paper and using recycled paper products is a good way to lessen the environmental footprint of a particular user or industry or company or something like that. Good argument, lots of facts to support that idea, but there's not much really to argue for. I think most people understand that implicitly. Now, why they might choose not to use recycled products, that may be a personal feeling that certain people use, or a certain perspective people take. So there's not much to debate there. By contrast, you should also avoid topics with which it's difficult to develop a fresh approach. That doesn't mean that topics like the ones listed here aren't interesting. It's just that often students find difficult or find the task difficult when it comes to offering something new to say about these hotly debated and often debated topics. I have always have in the back of my mind a student who decided to write about the death penalty. And I thought, okay, go ahead. And what is difficult about the death penalty is that while a student or a writer could have a moral, religious, or ethical reason for advocating in favor of the death penalty, if your audience does not have the same moral, ethical, or religious imperative to believe in the process of the death penalty, your argument becomes very difficult to fight against. And that's okay. It's fine to have that perspective. But then a lot of the research, the dearth of what's available in terms of the knowledge, suggests that it doesn't really work as a deterrent to crime, and that the process to house and feed and make sure that the people who are the prisoners who are assigned the death penalty are sort of kept in good stead until they exhaust their appeals process. A number of the factors related to the death penalty, I'll sum up, are suggesting that it's not a very good deterrent. So this student, in my case, he was a high school student. He was a sophomore, okay? So this guy's just 16 years old. He just changed his topic because it was easier to gather more information against the death penalty. He still believed in the death penalty, but he wrote his paper against it. So sometimes topics are difficult to approach with a fresh perspective. And also, of course, topics that are too narrow. Like, I give an example here. If you want to write a paper about whether Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and is better than Call of Duty, Cold War, that's fine. That might make for an interesting paper, but that's a little bit too specific for the needs of this kind of assignment. Okay, on to part 2, the actual drafting ideas. There are several invention strategies that you can use to sort of begin the writing process. We call these kinds of ideas brainstorming in the teaching biz, but they can include things like free writing or clustering, which is where you write about several different ideas and then try to form connections between them. Or you could use a good old-fashioned formal outline to facilitate the writing process. Kevin and I were talking about this before class began today. He's already got some ideas down for an outline, which is an excellent way to begin. No matter what you want to write about, at some point you're going to need to take a stand on the issue. And that means making a thesis statement. Now, we're all very familiar with what a thesis statement is, but this chapter includes a really good example of a thesis statement that has been refined a little bit. And let's take a look at that. Right? A thesis statement should express the point that you want to make in ways that are both specific and not necessarily overly wordy. Compare these two examples from your text for a minute. Okay. Colleges need to get students involved in environmental issues. Okay, that's not bad, but it's a little bit wordy and it's very vague. Whereas if you could revise that to read, colleges should institute programs and classes to show students the importance of using sustainable resources. That's a little bit more precise and less vague, right? That would be a good example. Now, here's one that's really wordy. Because issues that revolve around the environment are so crucial and so important, colleges should do more to increase student involvement in campus projects that are concerned with sustainability. Again, the idea is certainly there, and you can tease out what the student wants to say. But it may be a better thesis statement to just write down that because environmental issues are so important, colleges should take steps to involve students in campus sustainability projects, right? The idea here is that you want to express your point and explain what the topic is without being overly wordy. Always, of course, when we write, we should have the audience and the purpose behind our writing in the back of our minds. Now, this is a little bit strange because I'm your primary audience, right? But you should assume that your audience might be the group of people who are undecided about the potential topic you're writing for. Okay, so consider who that audience is. Ask yourself what they already know about the topic and what they bring to the reading experience. What is their belief? What is their background? What opinions do you think they already have? Sometimes you might know what the majority of their opinions will be. You should always assume, though, that even if they're skeptical of advancing or your position or adopting your position, that they're still receptive if your argument is good. Whatever your audience makeup might be, realize that there are going to be some people who will disagree no matter what, and some people who are already in favor of what you're saying. So try to ignore those two extremes. For the people who are intractable and already have a distinct view on the topic, try to do your best to get them to agree that you've at least made a good argument, okay? But realistically, you should aim for the people who are undecided and work to convince them of your perspective. Now, I've got the gentleman here from BuzzFeed Unsolved, if you've ever watched any of those videos on their YouTube channel. And you have the gentleman over here on the far left who is a time-honored skeptic, and the gentleman over here in the front, slightly in the front, on the right-hand side, who is a, I guess, more of a believer. He's more flexible in his thinking. That's a nice way to put it. but in the instances of that particular YouTube program, they always try to convince the audience using various forms of evidence, some more successfully than others. So when it comes to the evidence itself that you're gathering this week, try to evaluate the evidence to make sure that it's relevant and accurate. Also, make sure that it's representative, meaning that even if you find good evidence, it should be representative of a larger group or a large enough sample size so that it's not easily manipulated by unethical writers or other researchers. Of course, you should always be on the lookout for bias, speaking in those very same terms. Remember that bias just means a writer's use of preconceived ideas as support. Some of the best telltale signs for detecting bias are the presence of overly offensive statements or characterizations about the opposition. And then the use of tone, okay? If they're overly snarky or sarcastic in their approach, there's probably some degree of bias that's relatively apparent in that writing itself or in that source. Okay. So once you've attended to those concerns, it's time to begin the actual writing process. Now I'm going to jump back and forward a little bit here, but I'm going to come back. Don't worry about that. Generally speaking, when you are revising your, when you are planning on addressing your paper topic, you should use a fairly conventional or more familiar style of writing. And this means moving from material that is more general or broad to more specific ideas, sort of like a funnel approach. As you get into the body, though, as you get into the body of your paper, you may want to spend some time and dedicate some specific body paragraphs to the refutation of arguments. And this is good for several reasons. A good refutation allows you to not only create or generate enough content to meet page length and word length requirements on a paper, but it actually will endear you to your reader and make it appear as if you are a more well-rounded researcher who has thought about this topic, not just from their own perspective, but from a wider perspective. And if you've gone through the research process effectively, you won't just seem like you've done that. You will have done that, okay? As it says in this page, you should identify the most convincing arguments against your point of view and then refute them. Because again, a good refutation suggests that you respond effectively to criticisms, you present yourself as a more informed writer, and you're willing to address potential faults that may be part of your perspective. There are several refutation strategies that this chapter covers, so I'm going to briefly go through them. If you find a factual error in the research that you're using for support, identify that error and correct it with better information and explain that information. If you find in your research process that once you begin writing, you have insufficient support, pause in the writing process, save your progress, and look up more information. better facts, more examples as needed to prove your point. If you find that one of your sources, or perhaps even your own argument, contains some sort of illogical reasoning, identify what the fallacy is and then explain why the logic is flawed. If by chance, now this does happen on occasion when students are researching, if you find that you feel a source is good and it says exactly what you want to say, but you suspect there's some exaggeration at play, identify and explain why your source is overstating the case. We've already talked a little bit about bias, okay? If you find a biased source, you can still use it, but you can use it as a form of refuting the other or opposing argument. You could use it to show bias and exhibit how the writer's thinking might be flawed. But irrelevant arguments are usually not very useful. If you do find an irrelevant argument, though, you can always explain why it's not a pertinent argument and identify the issue that makes the statement irrelevant. Sometimes this can also be used as a potential source to strengthen or shore up your own perspective. But in my experience, I just ignore or don't use resources that have irrelevant arguments. I would just avoid them altogether. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the revision process. I know that this might have been a good place to have stopped and let you begin the writing process. But I think now that we're on the roll, we should just kind of push through all the way. When you're done writing, don't be surprised, like this example of the sophomore who was writing about the death penalty, if you have to go back and revise your thesis. Sometimes in the writing process, this happens. And so the second to last thing I always do is go back and review my thesis statement to make sure that it lines up with the argument I've constructed. Another good thing to do at this stage of the game is that if you feel the context of your paper is a little bit muddled, you may want to write some extra material to supply sufficient background information to your reader so that they have an appropriate degree of context when understanding your argument. Also, make sure that you have addressed your preferred type of argument to the writing task that you have introduced for your reader. Sometimes you might be arguing over the definition of a term or theory. A lot of students actually argued this type of paper in a persuasive essay when they tried to write, when they were writing successfully about whether or not they felt Goldman's language was misogynistic in The Princess Bride. But sometimes you're writing for a cause and effect analysis, like the comparison contrast paper topic for The Princess Bride. So if you're writing about why William Goldman changed some of the things from his original novel when he was adapting the screenplay, that might be a cause and effect relationship. Sometimes you're writing an evaluation argument, much as you did in the analysis at the assignment at the beginning of the semester. Sometimes, though, you're either proposing a change or a course of action that your reader might want to take, or just exploring the ethical merits of a particular topic, like the option exploring whether or not Inigo Montoya's quest for vengeance is something that's healthy. Okay, what to do now? You may want to begin structuring an outline to base your paper on. But as you continue, ask yourself a couple of questions. Is it worth your time to use the standards of logic, emotion, and theory to establish credibility with your audience. That old nutshell of logos, ethos, and pathos. Keep those in the back of your mind as you're writing. Make sure that as you begin the writing process, you are well informed about this topic so that you've covered the material in a way that's both reasonable and fair. Okay. When you're being fair, make sure that you're using the evidence that you've gathered in an effective way, that you're not trying to slant someone or slant a piece of evidence or quote somebody out of context. Of course, a general structure, like I talked about earlier, is a good way to begin. Move from more general to specific content. In your body paragraphs, try to incorporate topic sentences that align with ideas you introduced in your introduction. And save your opposing arguments in separate paragraphs. And then wrap up with a strong conclusion that reassert your thesis and summarizes your material before you conclude. Summarizes your evidence, I should say. Remember to adjust your material to the best type of argument. Make sure that what you're writing about is representative of the whole argument as it exists in the current climate. Try to select the most convincing evidence. And when you're selecting what material to quote from directly, save that for, the underlying information that you want your audience to grab hold of. The rest of the time, you should feel relatively comfortable either summarizing or paraphrasing relevant information. Keep the quotations in reserve for direct evidence to support ideas that you've already developed. Lastly, be aware of how you're using coordination and subordination. These are general tips offered by the authors, but remember that basically coordination means you're adding information together to express a link between themes or ideas. And that's where you use your coordinating conjunctions listed there. And when you're subordinating in your sentences, you're drawing a contrast between ideas. The other idea that the authors offer up is this idea of parallelism, which means simply matching the parts of speech in your writing to express corresponding idea strengths for your argument. Here's an example of parallel writing from your text. Creating a green campus is important because it sets an example for students and protects the environment. You have two action verbs, sets and protects, being used in a plural set form. Compare that to an example that's not parallel. Creating a green campus is important because it sets an example for students and the environment will be protected. Well, in the second version, it's not a bad sentence by any means, but it just doesn't contain that idealized parallel structure. Here's a similar example. Compare this unparalleled first version to the second version. Students can do their part to support a green campus in 4 ways. Now they're going to give us a list. By avoiding bottled water, use of electricity should be limited, and they can recycle packaging, and also educating themselves about environmental issues is a good strategy. This one's a little bit more obvious, right? Because you have 2 gerunds, educating and avoiding, along with can recycle, the verb complex, and should be limited. So there's a mix of forms going on here versus listen to this adaptation. Students can do their part to support a green campus in 4 ways. They still set up the list. by avoiding bottled water, limiting the use of electricity, recycling packaging, and educating themselves about environmental issues. They use a consistent form of gerund or ing word to introduce each of the 4 constituent elements. So parallelism, especially when you're introducing a whole host of material, is a good strategy to employ for all writing, but specifically, it's a good reminder, I think, to consider as we begin the writing of these argumentative essays. Okay, let's pause here for questions or concerns.
Okay.
Okay.
You said that you the funnel. Go ahead.
Oh, we had 2 people at the same time. Go ahead, Lucas, and then I'll come back to Kevin.
No, I just said that was well said, and it was a good PowerPoint. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, Kevin.
No,
Thank
you're
you.
good. I forgive you.
Kevin, what did you have?
I'm just wondering. I think I'm on the right track. You were saying to use a funnel for this. Go from general to specific. That's deductive reasoning, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So for traditional arguments, because there is so much room for error or to lose the attention span of your reader before you can fully form your ideas, as opposed to a persuasive essay, and a traditional argument like the one we're going to write probably supports deductive reasoning more efficiently.
So would it be safe to say?
So that's their suggestion.
Okay.
It's a suggestion, though.
Yeah, use a syllogism and an introduction, maybe just go to bottleneck it into deductive reasoning into the thesis.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. That can be a very effective way to set up your thesis. And once your thesis is clearly defined near the end of your introduction, whether you use a syllogism or not, you can then expand on that firm foundation of your introduction.
All right.
Good question.
Good question.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
What time is lunch?
Anytime you want, starting now. Okay, folks.
You need humor at this point. You really do.
That's right. That's right. One other thing I kind of skipped over really quickly is a reminder of the due date. This paper isn't due this week. It's not due next week. It's due the Friday of week 16, which is December 5th. Okay, December 5th by midnight. So you should go ahead.
Is it the 4th? I just looked at my.
Does it say 4th?
Well, you said Friday. Sorry, just looking at it. It's Saturday's the 5th. Friday's the 4th.
Oh, well, okay. I mean, I thought it was the 5th. My mistake.
No, you originally said the 4th when you first gave the assignment, but if you want to make it the 5th. Yeah.
Well, let's just say that you can have the 5th if you need it. How about that? Without any penalty.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I don't want to take up any more of your time because, like I said, I would like you to use some of your remaining class session time, at least, to perhaps just do some research this week or line up some of your ideas. But while I am going to conclude today's lecture recording, as always, anybody who wants to remain after to ask some direct follow-up questions, you may certainly do so. I welcome you, I look forward to that. But for now, if there aren't any other immediate large-scale questions, I'm going to go ahead and thank you for your time and your attention today. And I'll remind you to stay healthy and stay hungry for knowledge. And we'll pick up the conversation next week. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, you
And hang
too.
around.
Mr.